Shalom, shalom. Here Israel. This is your Tazadak. I'm going to start off by giving honor and glory to Yahweh, Ba'ashim Yahushai. This Romans chapter 3. I'm going to go into a little bit of some precepts and go verse by verse. Salakia, just bear with me 1 second. All right. It's the book of Romans chapter 3 and verse 1. What advantage then hath the Jew, or what profit is there of circumcision? So here in the first verse, Paul is speaking both to Jews, practicing Jews, and Gentiles, which are Israelite foreigners. And essentially in this whole chapter, the whole gist of the him opening up the chapter with this verse is him speaking to the two groups of people, Jews and Gentiles. Having fallen short, essentially he's telling them that they have fallen short of the true righteousness, which is the practice of the law and its outcomes, spiritual and physical, which not only pertains, like I just said, to carnal works, but also the inner man. And his works are the works of the law are manifested in the outer man, like Paul spake of in the previous chapter. And in this chapter, it also introduces the faith into the concept of things. So here in verse 1, Paul particularly is speaking to the Israelite Gentile foreigner who at this time was a stranger to the customs and beliefs of the practicing Jew. So verse 1, he's essentially saying to the Gentile, so now you believe that Yahushua is Hamashiach and how he came to redeem Israel from their sins. Now let me show you what advantage there is in being a practicing Jew, or in the practice and customs of the law and things pertaining to it. And what profit is there of circumcision, essentially is what he's saying, because in those times, those that were of the circumcision were known as those that had kept the law, that had been keeping the practices. Now, circumcision here is used as an example, keeping one of the covenants commanded to the lineage of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. So these descendants essentially were given in that commandment or covenant of the circumcision. So these are essentially one of the examples Paul uses to show how one is righteous before God, or the concept of that is justification before the Most High. Because again, these laws, the commandments were given to the people of Israel to keep and within their lineage and their generations. So just to get into that briefly, we have to examine the word and its etymology and how it is applied through the Hebraic perspective. By Hebraic, I'm referencing the Semitic language, which along with the Israelite perspective that comes with it. Because again, like Paul taught in the previous chapter, he taught the Jews at that time how there were some Gentiles who, without knowledge of the law, were already practicing some things contained in the law without formally being taught. So let's look at the word translation for righteousness or righteous, which is repeated. It's a repeated wording and concept used many times, not just in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament, so-called. Also, like I said, Old Testament in the law. And also that concept is is expounded on in the prophets. Now, let's take a look at the etymology. Slack here, just bear with me 1 moment. Slack here. Okay, see if I got it right here. Just bear with me. Okay, so and as you can see in the New Testament alone, this wording is used 92 times. So this is why etymologies are so important. And by etymology, I mean the study of the origin of words. So let's go over it a little bit. And so righteousness is essentially what's approved in the eyes of the Most High, or equity, in other words, uprightness. So let's look at the etymology. So it says dikaios one, which is defined as righteousness, justice. The usage, usually if not always in a Jewish atmosphere, justice, justness, righteousness. Righteousness of which God is a source or author, but practically a divine righteousness. So again, these things pertain to the inner man and the outer man. So the concept is spoken of many times, like I said, in the scriptures. So let's look at the word study. It says decay, a judicial verdict, properly judicial, the verdict of approval, the approval of God, divine approval. So let's scroll down a little bit right here. See if we can just briefly go over it. So it says, in the broad sense, the state of him who is such as he ought to be, the condition acceptable to God. It says, universally, the doctrine concerning the way in which man may attain to a state approved of God. So that's from Hebrews 5:13. It's giving it that scripture for reference. It says integrity, virtue, purity of life, uprightness, correctness in thinking, feeling, and acting. So let's scroll down a little bit more. It's also used to define walking in the way of righteousness, equivalent to an upright, righteous man, or the righteousness with which God demands. So again, this concept is used many times, and we have to look at the word etymology because it goes hand in hand as to what the scriptures teach about what is righteousness. So again, Paul is touching on this in the first verse. So let's get a precept just to establish the matter a bit more. So the exhaustive concordance says equity of character or act, especially Christian justification, righteousness. So let's go to first precept we're going to touch on. The book of Romans chapter 10 verse 5. For Moses describeth the righteousness which is of the law, that the man which doeth those things shall live by them. So again, this is what Paul was teaching. You may take one verse and just automatically assume that Paul is telling the Jews at that time and the Israelite foreigners to throw away the law, but that is far from fact. So essentially, this was what Paul was introducing to the Israelite foreigners, the Gentiles, about this concept of being justified in the sight of the Most High, which and also it pertains to uprightness, essentially according to the precepts that the Most High commanded and ordained through Moses to the Israelites. So again, Paul is speaking to Jews and Israelite foreigners. So let's go to establish the concept to Leviticus chapter 26 and verse 3. This book of Leviticus chapter 26 and verse 3. And it reads, "If you walk in my statutes and keep my commandments and do them." Verse 13. Bear with me. "I am Yahweh your God, which brought you forth out of the land of Egypt, that ye should not be their bondmen. And I have broken the bands of your yoke, and made you go upright." So again, these are the things that Paul was teaching. Uprightness, the commandments. He was essentially in the first verse, Paul was telling the Jews and the Israelite foreigners in the epistle, he's telling them, look, you have to not only have the belief, you have to know where these prophecies came from, how Yahushua was sent to the nation, how he was supposed to be delivered up. Because again, there was Jews and Gentiles at that time. They believed in these things, but they didn't have the understanding of the origins of these things, and also the practices, the practical understanding of the execution of the law. So again, the commandments, uprightness, integrity, these things, this is what the commandments do. Keep the commandments, it's more than just following it to the letter. It's also the, moral integrity that comes with it. So you have to have both things. And also, again, the previous chapter, this is what Paul explained to the Jews and the Gentiles, saying to the Jews that that it's more than just following the law to the letter or to the T, pursuant to chapter 2 in Romans verse 29. But it starts inwardly. And to the Gentiles, he was saying that it's more than he was saying, essentially just it's more than just justifying your own concept of what is moral or correct. So again, these things have to go through according to what was commanded in the precepts. Also, by knowing what morally is not correct, which is what the law tells you also. The law being the knowledge of sin and where you're going off, pursuant to verse 20 in the same chapter. So again, not only does the law tell you what is sin, but also the law is telling you the correct things that you are commanded to do throughout your generations. So let's go to verse 20, just go over that briefly. It's book of Romans chapter 3 and verse 20. Bear with me. "Therefore, by the deeds of the law, there shall no flesh be justified in his sight, for by the law is the knowledge of sin." So again, these are the things that that the commandments speak of. Where you're going off, what is correct. So it's more than just following it to the letter. But doing what's equitable, just in the law. So that is essentially what will justify you. Um, so Paul doesn't contradict himself, but people forget Paul was essentially writing to two different groups of people. So you have to go into the minds of those two different types of ways of thinking at the time, the Jews and the Gentiles. Now let's move on to verse 2. Book of Romans chapter 3 and verse 2. So I'll start at 1 and go down to verse 2. What advantage then hath the Jew? Or what profit is there of circumcision? Verse 2. Much, chiefly every way. Slakia, much every way chiefly, because that unto them were committed the oracles of God. So now in this verse, Paul is making the point that essentially I just made. So he's speaking to the Gentiles here that although you believe Yahweh Shai, and now he's come to redeem Israel from their sins, now this is a way of him introducing them, which is the Israelite foreigners, and pointing them to how that concept was established. So the belief in Hamashiach and in remission of sins. Because again, you had at that time Gentiles coming back into the fold. And this is what Paul was writing to mainly the Israelite foreigners, but there was Jews that believed in Yahweh Shai and had the practical knowledge of the customs of the law. So this is which is spoken of in the law. And Paul promoted essentially to these two groups the careful study of these things commanded in the law. So let's go to the next precept. It's the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 4 and verse 8. Book of Deuteronomy, chapter 4 and verse 8. Slackish, bear with me. And what nation is there so great that hath statutes and judgments so righteous as all this law which I set before you this day? Verse 10. Especially the day that thou stoodest before the Lord thy God in Horeb, when the Lord said unto me, Gather me the people together, and I will make them hear my words, that they may learn to fear me all the days that they shall live upon the earth, and that they may teach their children. So again, this is what was commanded in the law. To keep the teachings, the practices, and the customs throughout the generations. So this is what Paul was pointing to the Israelite foreigners too, those which didn't have the practical knowledge of the law. So let's go to the next precept. Now these are things that are viable to when and start coming into the fold, which is what Paul was teaching essentially. It's the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 5, verse 23. So the last precept I read, this was what was commanded, to the Israelites at Horeb, to teach their children these customs and these laws. So this book of Deuteronomy, chapter 5 and verse 23. And it came to pass, when you heard the voice out of the midst of the darkness, for the mountain did burn with fire, that ye came near unto me, even all the heads of your tribes and your elders. Verse 24. And ye said, Behold, the Lord our God hath showed us his glory and his greatness, and we have heard his voice out of the midst of the fire. We have seen this day that God doth talk with man, and he liveth. Now therefore, why should we die? For this great fire will consume us, if we hear the voice of the Lord our God any more, then we shall die. So again, these are the Israelites that this is what Moses was putting back into remembrance to the Israelites, that when the Most High appeared to them to command the law to them, um, they couldn't withstand the sight of the burning and the fire in the mountain. So let's read on just to see what it's speaking on. Verse 25. Salakia, verse 26. For who is there of all flesh that hath heard the voice of the living God, speaking out of the midst of the fire, as we have and lived? Go thou near and hear all that the Lord our God shall say, and speak thou unto us all that the Lord our God shall speak unto thee, and we will hear it and do it. And the Lord heard the voice of your words which ye spake unto me. And the Lord said unto me, I have heard the voice of the words of this people, which they have spoken unto thee. They have well said all that they have spoken. So again, this is the main reason why Moses was that mediator first to the children of Israel. And this was Paul was leading the Gentiles. The reason why Paul was leading Gentiles to the law. So they knew the reason why the oracles were, the law was so important, and to give them understanding. For example, in Deuteronomy, he was appointed that mediator. So Yahweh Shai was also prophesied of in the book of Deuteronomy. So this is why it's essential to know the things in the law, especially to the Israelite foreigners that believed in Yahweh Shai. They believed that they had a chance to return to the covenants, to the laws of the customs. So let's go to the next precept, book of Deuteronomy, chapter 18 and verse 15. Book of Deuteronomy, chapter 18 and verse 15. The Lord thy God will raise up unto thee a prophet from the midst of thee, of thy brethren, like unto me. Unto him ye shall hearken. Verse 16. According to all that thou desirest of the Lord thy God in Horeb, in the day of the assembly, saying, Let me not hear again the voice of the Lord my God, neither let me see this great fire any more, that I die not. Verse 17. And the Lord said unto me, They have well spoken that which they have spoken. So again, this is why Moses was that first mediator. And here, why Moses was commanded, to give them the laws, and the practices. And also because it couldn't withstand the sight when those things were commanded. So they asked essentially Most High to appoint Moses as the mediator. Now this is Moses through the Most High prophesying of the coming Messiah. And this is why it's important that the Israelite foreigners had knowledge of these things. Again, the reason why Paul was saying, that is an advantage of knowing the oracles. So let's read at verse 18. I will raise them up a prophet from among their brethren, like unto thee, and will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak unto them all that I shall command him. Verse 19. And it shall come to pass, that whoever will not hearken unto my words, which he shall speak in my name, I will require it of him. So again, this is what was prophesied of the coming Messiah, of Mashiach Yahweh Shai. So again, you had that the Israelite foreigners or Gentiles who were just coming into the faith had to be grounded in the understanding. So let's go to the precept to establish that matter. The book of Ephesians, chapter 2 and verse 20. and are built upon the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Yahushua HaMashiach himself being the chief cornerstone. So these are the things that were essential, to knowing not just the gospel, which Yahushua preached, but also the law and the prophets, because all these things were prophesied Yahushua Mashiach. Now let's go to the next precept, which establishes what was prophesied of Yahushua in book of Deuteronomy chapter 18. It is the book of Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 18. Slackish, bear with me. Book of Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 18. For ye are not come unto the mount that might be touched, and that burned with fire, nor unto blackness and darkness and tempest. Verse 19. And the sound of a trumpet, and the voice of words, which voice they that heard entreated that the word should not be spoken unto them any more. So again, this is the what was read in the book of Deuteronomy. It was such a fearful sight that they asked the Most High to appoint Moses over them to command the precepts to them. Verse 20, for they could not endure which was commanded, and if so much as a beast touch the mountain, it shall be stoned, or thrust thorough with a dart. Verse 21, and so terrible was the sight that Moses said, I exceedingly fear and quake. But ye are come unto Mount Zion, and unto the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to an innumerable company of angels. Verse 23, to the general assembly and church of the firstborn, which are written in heaven, and to God the judge of all, and to the spirits of just men made perfect. Verse 24, and to Yahushua, the mediator of the new covenant, and to the blood of sprinkling, that speaketh better things than that of Abel. So again, this is it's taking the account from Deuteronomy, and also it's speaking on and establishing how Yahushua Mashiach was prophesied in that book of Deuteronomy. So he was that next mediator, the next prophet to come up and speak the words commanded of him. At the time, when Yahushua came and preached the gospel to the Jews and the Israelite foreigners through Paul and his ministry, and through the disciples and through the apostles. Verse 25. See that ye refuse not him that speaketh. For if they escape not who refused him that spake on earth, much more shall not we escape if we turn away from him that speaketh from heaven. So again, this is how Yahushua Mashiach was prophesied of. These are things that were essential in knowing if you were coming back into the fold. So let's move on to verse 3. Slackish, bear with me. This book of Romans chapter 3 and verse 3. For what, if some did not believe, shall their unbelief make the faith of God without effect? So now Paul he's talking to the Jews, because there were many Jews essentially who believed in Yahushua. Although the ruling class rejected him for the most part, there were also some Jews who did not believe that the Gentiles, the Israelite foreigners, could not be saved, because they weren't circumcised, they weren't coming up to the feast days, offering the necessary sacrifices during those times. and mainly coming up to Jerusalem, and doing what was commanded in the precepts. But again, like I went through in the previous videos, there was 100 years of what was written um, during the Greeks and the Romans. They had that essentially that persecution and assimilation going on. But in the second part of the verse, Paul was aiming this mainly towards the Gentiles, saying because some Jews believed, you know, that you couldn't be saved. Does that make your belief to no effect? Because of that, that doesn't nullify, the faith that these Israelite foreigners were coming into the fold. They believed in Yahweh. They believed in the remission of sins, but they had no formal knowledge of the law. So now let's move on to verse 4. Book of Romans chapter 3 and verse 4. God forbid. Yea, let God be true, but every man a liar, as it is written, that thou mightest be justified in thy sayings, and mightest be overcome when thou art judged. So verse 4, Paul was essentially speaking to the Jews and the Gentiles in this verse, that God's essentially the oracles, the utterances, the Holy Scriptures, you only be justified with how you obtain the knowledge and use it in practically. So that is your works. When you have the faith and you execute it through your works. This is what was spoken of in the book of James. So now let's go to the next precept. This book of Luke chapter 11 verse 27. Book of Luke chapter 11 verse 27. And it came to pass, as he spake these things, a certain woman of the company lifted up her voice and said unto him, Blessed is the womb that bare thee, and the paps which thou hast sucked. Verse 28. But he said, Yea, rather blessed are they that hear the word of God and keep it. So again, this is Yahweh Shai. He was, explaining how, it's good, to hear these things, but to, manifest them through your works as a practice, that's what's the most important part. So now let's move on to Romans 3 and 5. This book Romans chapter 3 and verse 5. But if our righteousness command the righteousness of God, what shall we say? Is God unrighteous who taketh vengeance? I speak as a man. So now to understand this verse a little more, we must, and it's imperative that we look at the various translations and cross-examine each of them, especially in these next few verses. Paul, he takes aim at the Jews, mainly the ruling class, those who rejected Yahweh Shai and his teachings, because he was putting their hypocrisy out in the open, and also ruling the people, the multitude, unjustly, which was at that time, the population of Jews under the Romans living in Jerusalem. So let's look into that translation so we can get the understanding. So here's the translation from the New Living Translation, which says, But some might say our sinfulness serves a good purpose, for it helps people see how righteous God is. Isn't it unfair then for him to punish us? This is merely a human point of view. So again, Paul is saying, um, to the Jews that were ruling the population, you know, that despised the people, you know, and what they were doing is essentially they were um, they were hypocrites, you know. So they 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 made it seem like they were just in their commandments, telling people not to um, heal on the Sabbath, especially Yahushai, but they just seemed righteous, but they were, they were being sinful men because they despised even the publicans. So they just made it. This is Paul. This is what he was speaking of. He was speaking about those Jews, you know, because they just wanted to seem righteous. So, and Yahushua, when he came, he was prophesying that destruction. So their mindset, this is what Paul was bringing out into the open, you know, this is why he said, isn't it unfair then for him to punish us? Because when Yahushua and even, you know, the scribes and the Pharisees, they came to the baptism of John, of Yahushua, and also when he was baptizing the population, he told them, he said, you generation of vipers, who's going to warn you for the destruction to come? So they were prophesying destruction even in the beginning of John's ministry. So this is what Paul was speaking of in this verse. So let's go to the next precept. Is in Book of Luke, chapter 11. Slack it, just bear with me. Book of Luke, chapter 11, verse 37. And as he spake, a certain Pharisee besought him to dine with him. And he went in and sat down to meat. Verse 38. And when the Pharisee saw it, he marveled that he had not first washed before dinner. And the Lord said unto him, Now do ye Pharisees make clean the outside of the cup and the platter, but your inward part is full of ravening and wickedness. Verse 40. Ye fools, did not he that made that which is without make that which is within also? So, essentially Yahushua, he was calling out these Pharisees, he was telling them that their wickedness started on the inside. And they just made it seem like they were righteous on the outside. But inside they were full of wickedness, they despised the population, and they were covetous. So again, this is what Paul was speaking of in verse 5. These are the things that also, Yahushua taught and rebuked. So now let's go to Book of Matthew, chapter 23 and verse 30. Book of Matthew, chapter 23 and verse 30. And say, if we had been in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partakers with them in the blood of the prophets. Verse 31. Wherefore ye be witnesses unto yourselves, that ye are the children of them which killed the prophets. Verse 32. Fill ye up then the measure of your fathers. Ye serpents, ye generation of vipers, how can ye escape the damnation of hell? Verse 30. Verse 30. Actually, that's the point, Yahushua was making. To these scribes, Pharisees, who seem righteously, outwardly, but inwardly they were hypocrites. So now let's go to the next precept. Book of Luke, chapter 16 and verse 8. Book of Luke, chapter 16, verse 8. And the Lord commanded the unjust steward, because he had done wisely. For the children of this world are in their generation wiser than the children of light. So this is the parable about the unjust steward. And again, this was speaking to those in the ruling class of the Jews. This is what the example Yahushua was using in this parable. Now, let's go to, let's see, I believe it's verse 8. And the Lord commanded the unjust steward, because he had done wisely. Slack 14. And the Pharisees also, who were covetous, heard all these things, and they derided him. So again, they were upset, because he was, talking about these things. Verse 15, and he said unto them, Ye are they which justify yourselves before men, but God knoweth your hearts. For that which is highly esteemed amongst men is abomination in the sight of God. So this is what Paul was teaching against. He was telling the Israelite foreigners, look, don't make the same mistake that these Jews, mainly in the ruling class, they were making. They had a certain amount of faith because they were willing to follow the law to make animal sacrifice during that time while the temple was still around. But inwardly, their spirit was off. So this is what Paul, in verse 5 was mainly writing to the Israelite foreigners coming into the fold at the time. So, and he's also getting on the Jews, saying, essentially, God is not unfair to punish those that despise even, the baptism that and the ministry that John was making. So all these things had to happen, because the Jews, they were promoting that hypocrisy, right? So let's go to the next precept. Book of Proverbs, chapter 17, verse 15. And it reads, He that justifieth the wicked, and he that condemneth the just, even they both are an abomination to the Lord. So again, these were the things that were promoted, was that covetousness, that hypocrisy. These Jews were ruling unjustly, and the Jews knew that destruction was coming to the land because, like I said, Paul spoke about it. John in his ministry spoke about Yahushua. So this was also just another shot, Paul was throwing at the Jews in this verse. So now let's go to back to the book of Romans. Is a book of Romans, chapter 3 and verse 7. Let's see, or actually I'll go to 6. God forbid, for then how shall God judge the world? So God is not one to justify the wicked, and condemn the just. He doesn't, but he created these unjust men to be destroyed. So again, everything has to have a balance. Everything has to have, its order. So let's move on to verse 7. For if the truth of God have more abounded through my lie unto his glory, why yet am I also judged as a sinner? So in this verse, Paul is just speaking on how the Jews have slandered him. Like they slandered Yahushua, and verse 7, Paul is getting on the Jews again because they were judging, unrighteously. Justice seemed righteous, but they were claiming, that they were justified, because, they claimed to be teachers, of the law, wise men. So this was one of the purpose of Yahweh Shai coming on the scene. He had to condemn these men, prophesy the destruction coming, and magnify the law. Let's go to the next precept, Book of Luke, chapter 13 and verse 10. And it reads, "And he was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath. And behold, there was a woman which had a spirit of infirmity 18 years, and was bowed together, and could in no wise lift up herself." So, this woman had essentially a, what do you call it, like a crooked back. She had spirits on her. Right? Verse 12. "And when Yahushua saw her, he called her to him, and said unto her, Woman, thou art loosed from thy infirmity." Verse 13. "And he laid his hands on her, and immediately she was made straight, and glorified God." Verse 14. "And the ruler of the synagogue answered with indignation, because that Yahushua healed on the Sabbath day, and said unto the people, There are 6 days in which men ought to work. In them therefore come and be healed, and not on the Sabbath day." Verse 15. "The Lord then answered him and said, Thou hypocrite, does not each one of you on the Sabbath loose his ass or his ox from the stall, and lead him away to watering?" Verse 16. "And ought not this woman, being a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan had bound, lo, these 18 years, be loosed from this bond on the Sabbath day?" So, how wish I was saying, that to these ruling Jews, he was telling them, you take your animal to get water, how much more this woman, which is a, descendant of Abraham, because this was actually one of the important customs in the East, which was a, the attention was given to the animals, and I believe I have a precept on that, so animals, unlike here in the Western world, they were given, less care, less attention, but everything was first, um, um, essentially, it was a custom was to take care of the animals first. I believe that's in Judges. Let me see if I can get that precept. But let me finish reading. Let's actually finish reading this verse. Verse 17. "And when he had said these things, all his adversaries were ashamed, and all the people rejoiced for all the glorious things that were done by him." So, although they were, they thought they were doing good by giving the law, weight, by commanding these people, you know, come and be healed, but not on the Sabbath day. This is what Paul was speaking on in I believe in verse 5. This is the mindset that these people had. They were doing evil so good things may come, so people may glorify God. Oh, these men are righteous, they're keeping the practices, the law, they're wise men. So that's why distraction had to come, and this is why you have to have the real understanding that as it was written. For them back then, or you wouldn't understand the original context when Yahushua said, "Those my enemies, bring them and slay them before me." We'll get to that precept. First, let me see if I can pull up this precept on, I believe it's in the book of Judges, about taking care of the animals. Because, again, that was an important custom back in the East. because without your animal, you know, you wouldn't have your transportation. You wouldn't have you know your you know your milk, things of that sort. You had to have. This is why the animals were so important back then. You know, you wouldn't have your the things that came from those animals, the meat, the the goods that you could obtain from selling cattle, things of that sort. So let's go to that precept, see if I can pull it up real quick. Slackish, bear with me. See, Judges. So let's start at verse 1. Book of Judges, chapter 19, verse 1. And it came to pass in those days, when there was no king in Israel, that there was a certain Levite sojourning in the side of Mount Ephraim, who took unto him a concubine out of Bethlehem, Judah. So, essentially, his concubine that played the whore, he had separated from her and then reconciled back with her. But the main point is that, let's see, so he went to reconcile himself to his concubine to his father-in-law's home. So, let's see. Let's see, and this is when they had went to sojourn in the land of the Benjamites, when they had left the father-in-law's house. So this book of Judges, chapter 19, verse 17. And when he had lifted up his eyes, he saw a wayfaring man in the street of the city. And the old man said, Whither goest thou? And whence comest thou? And he said unto him, We are passing from Bethlehem, Judah, toward the side of Mount Ephraim. From thence am I. And I went to Bethlehem, Judah, but I am now going to the house of the Lord, and there is no man that receiveth me the house. Verse 19, Yet there is both straw and provender for our asses, and there is bread and wine also for me and for thy handmaid, and for the young man which is with thy servants. There is no want of anything. And the old man said, Peace be with thee. Howsoever, let all thy ways, thy wants lie upon me. Only lodge not in the street. Verse 21, So he brought him into his house, and gave provender unto the asses. And they washed their feet, and did eat and drink. So, this is one of the, important customs, in the East. You got to take care of the animals first. Before you would even wash your guests' feet, you had to, make sure the animals were fed, make sure they were rested, so you can resume on the journey. So, again, this was the hypocrisy that was coming from these Pharisees and scribes and rulers. They, they just, to seem righteous, they were telling, the people, come in, but not on the Sabbath day to get healed. But this woman, she was, a descendant, of the chosen bloodline, and they were neglecting the healing of the devils that she and the spirits that she had on her. So these are one of the examples why Paul was getting on these Jews, in the fifth verse. So let's see. So now let's go to, and actually, we were go back on verse 8. Book of Romans, chapter 3 and verse 8. And not rather as we be slanderously reported, and as some affirm that we say, let us do evil, that good may come, whose damnation is just. Right? So, you know, this is how they were, you know, justifying the wicked and condemning the just. You know, and actually, let me see if I can pull up the transliteration, because it could be confusing if you're not looking at the proper understanding of this verse also. Let's see if I can pull it up. Slack here, bear with me. Romans 3 and 8. So, you know, Paul, you know, verses 5 through 8, he was essentially telling that, getting on the Jews, you know, for being hypocrites. See if I can pull this up right here. All right. It says, but someone might still argue, how can God condemn me as a sinner if my dishonesty highlights his truthfulness and brings him more glory? So again, Paul is not speaking of himself, neither is he speaking of any Jews and Gentiles to them in this letter, but he's using a clear-cut example that the Jews and ruling class were known for that hypocrisy, for seeming righteous in the sights of men. You know, their falsehood. You know, they were attempting to enhance the truthfulness of God through wickedness, through hypocrisy, to make it seem as they were righteous men, but inwardly they were prideful men. So this is what Paul was speaking of in Romans 3, 5 through 8. So Romans chapter 3 and verse 8. And some people even slander us by claiming that we say the more we sin, the better it is. Those who say such things deserve to be condemned. So, you know, you could get twisted up with this thing, you know. You could, you know, think that Paul, you know, he's talking about himself, but he's still talking about those Jews in the ruling class that were promoting that hypocrisy. So let's look at the word by word translation. It says, why not, as some slanderously claim, we say, let us do evil, that good may result. You know, so this is what the Jews in the ruling class were doing. They were wicked. They tried to seem as they were doing good through their wicked acts. And it says their condemnation is deserved. So, you know, Paul knew that destruction was coming. So he was essentially telling those reading the epistle, you know, they're doing what they're supposed to. They're supposed to be destroyed. You know, like it says in the book of Jude, you know, wandering stars whose end is their destruction. So now let's move on to Romans 3 and 9. Book of Romans chapter 3 and verse 9. What then? Are we better than they? In no wise, for we have before proved, both Jews and Gentiles, that they are all under sin. You know, so Paul's saying essentially he's no better as a Jew than a Gentile, an Israelite foreigner, you know, or a Jew compared to an Israelite foreigner. So again, people want to twist the scripture and use it as a false rhetoric and say that Paul is talking about everybody. But here Paul is talking to the same two groups of people that he touches on in all the epistles. People of the same nation, the Israelites. Now, Paul, in these verses, he's explaining that all Jews and Gentiles have fallen short, essentially. So that's verses 9 through 10 through 18. So this is all quoting the book of Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah. So now let's read on to verse 19. Book of Romans chapter 3 and verse 19. Now we know that what things soever the law saith, it saith to them who are under the law, that every mouth may be stopped, and all the world may become guilty before God. So Paul here, he's making a valid point to both Jews and Gentiles. Here saying that both, they're under the law. These are the two people both under the law. So you can't just take the previous verse and apply it to everyone, even today. But you have to understand it as how it was written back then, first and foremost. So here Paul is saying that both of these groups of people, they're obliged to keep the law. Why? Because it was commanded to the Israelites throughout the generations. And basically, this is what Paul, through his ministry, he was attempting to unite these two groups, because you had to take the two minds of thinking, the two modes of thinking, and intertwine them into one letter by telling them, for this reason, each group should edify one another. So this was the whole purpose of what Paul was speaking on. Instead of despising one another, or there being divisions in these different churches. For example, the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. This is an example that Yahushua used also. So let's go to that precept, book of Luke, chapter 18 and verse 9. Book of Luke, chapter 18 and verse 9. And it reads, And he spake this parable unto certain which trusted in themselves, that they were righteous, and despised the other. So there was certain people, mainly, the Pharisees, they despised, especially the tax collectors, the publicans, called them sinners, So this is what Paul was speaking on also. Let's go to the next precept just to, so we can get the understanding. Book of Galatians, chapter 3 and verse 10. And it reads, For as many are of the works of the law are under the curse. For it is written, Cursed is every one that continueth not in all the things which are commanded in the book of the law to do them. So, this was Paul, writing to another church, but, all these things go together. This proves he's speaking to people of the same nation. Because if you go back to the law, it tells you who was commanded to keep the customs and the precepts. So let's go to the second chapter in the book of Galatians and read chapter 3. Galatians chapter 2 and verse 3. And it reads, But neither Titus, who was with me, being a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. Verse 6. But of these who seem to be somewhat, whatsoever they were, it maketh no matter. That, wait a minute, I think that's a different one. Slackers, bear with me. I think I highlighted the wrong precept. So 2. Slackers, bear with me. Might be Ephesians. Let's 6 and 12. Okay, so it's book of Ephesians, chapter 2, verse 3. And it reads, among whom also we all had our conversation in times past, in the lust of our own flesh, fulfilling the desire of the flesh and of the mind, and were by nature the children of wrath, even as others. Verse 6. And hath raised us up together, and made us sit together in heavenly places in Hamashiach Yahushai. Verse 12. That at that time you were without Hamashiach, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers from the covenants of promise, having no hope, and without God in the world. So this again, establishes that Paul was speaking to and making the comparisons to different people of the same nation. Let's go to the next precept in Galatians. Book of Galatians, chapter 3 and verse 19. And it reads, wherefore then serveth the law, it was added because of transgressions, till the seed should come to whom the promise was made, and it was ordained by angels in the hand of a mediator. So again, this is why the law was added, and it shows you to whom the law pertains to. So now let's go back to the book of Romans. Go to verse 20. Book of Romans, chapter 3 and verse 20. And it reads, therefore, by the deeds of the law, there shall no flesh be justified in his sight, for by the law is the knowledge of sin. So, again, it's saying, like I made the previous example, that Yahushua proved that both the law is not justification, the deed, that the law commands, but using it correctly is truly how you're justified. Like the ruler of the synagogue, he told Yahushua, and the people, to not come and be healed on that day. So let's go to that account. It's in book of Luke, chapter 14 and verse 1. Just to, we touched on that account, but just to give you a little more insight, go to the book of Luke. It's book of Luke, chapter 14 and verse 1. And it came to pass, as he went into the house of one of the chief Pharisees to eat bread on the Sabbath day, that they watched him. So they were watching Yahushua, they're keeping an eye on him, but he had rebuked them already, because the ruler was telling him, not to heal people on that day, but he made his point, confirming, that what he was doing was justified. So let's go to the book of Luke, chapter 13, verse 10. And it reads, and he was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath. So Yahushua, these are the things that he was teaching. And this goes into the account where I brought it out earlier, that Yahushua, he was healing them, but he was justified in what he was doing, because he was doing it correctly. So now let's go back to the book of Romans, chapter 3, verse 21. But now the righteousness of God without the law is manifested, being witnessed by the law and the prophets. So now, that righteousness of God without the law is, what is manifested? How? Like the point I just made, to not the deeds or the words of the law, but by what's manifested through your inward man and executed through your works. That's how you're justified in executing the law and the precepts. And how is that witness to the law? So now that's what that's speaking of. You know. So so that's how the righteousness of God without the law is manifested, without the letter of the law, because it's witnessed, by the law and the prophets, right? But this is actually, also talking about how Yahweh was prophesied of, and how, the Israelite foreigners, they had to know that, how Yahweh came into play into all this, and also him coming and rebuking these Jews, on how to correctly keep the law and the true purposes of the law, like him saying, that the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. So it wasn't just a custom to keep, but it was a practice that was designed along with, with the rest of the precepts in the law to show you where you're going off, and also how to, let your slaves get rest, how to refresh yourself, which is the true purpose of the Sabbath. So you are to be refreshed on that day. Right, so let's go to the next precept in Book of Isaiah, chapter 42 and 21. Book of Isaiah, chapter 42, verse 21. Slacky. The Lord is well pleased for his righteousness' sake. He will magnify the law and make it honorable. So that was what the purpose of Yahweh coming on the scene. And also pursuant to Deuteronomy 18, 15 through 19. He came on the scene, because that's who was supposed to be Slacky. I'm having some technical difficulties. Bear with me 1 second. Slacky. So this is one of the reasons why Yahweh came on the scene. He was to be that witness, magnify the law. Also he was that prophet that was supposed to be raised up of his brethren, so they would hear, the Jews, the Gentiles, to get this nation to come together. This is what was written, for Paul to teach at that time, and even for today. So this is why Paul was pointing the Israelite foreigners back to the law. This is why he quoted the prophets. This is why he quoted Isaiah in his epistles. So let's go to so when you have that understanding, why these things had to all come to pass. So let's go to the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 18, verse 15. And it reads, The Lord thy God will raise up unto thee a prophet from the midst of thee, of thy brethren, like unto me, and unto him ye shall hearken. Verse so that's who it was, Yahweh, who was supposed to be raised up, for the time to come. And this was one of the prophecies that Moses spoke to the Israelites, to the Most High. Verse 19, and it shall come to pass that whosoever will not hearken unto my words, which he shall speak in my name, I will require it of him. So those mainly of the Jews, the ruling class, who didn't hearken to Yahweh, this is why he prophesied that destruction, and for the whole nation that was residing there at the time. This is why he had to become that sacrifice, that living sacrifice. because after 7 AD, the temple was going to be destroyed. So there had to be a way for the sins to be appropriated without, animal sacrifice. So all these things were prophesied since the beginning. Because he witnessed for that time to come, to the Jews, to warn them of the destruction, show them the true way, to execute the law, and the living sacrifice. After his death, for the atonement of sins. Because you had at the time, when we had the temple to offer up sacrifice and the gifts, and like the sacrificial gift was made as a way to cover sins, Yahushua was that sacrifice for atonement for sins, being representative of the grace the Most High gave to the children of Israel, the Jews and the Gentiles. Now let's go to the next precept. So again, these are the things that you had to know. Book of Romans, chapter 5 and verse 20. And it reads, "Moreover, the law entered, that the offense might abound. But where sin abounded, grace did much more abound." So, when you had committed a sin, back then, you had to offer up, some turtle doves or, depending on the transgression. But, the fact that you can offer up a sacrifice was to a certain extent, a grace that the Most High gave the children of Israel. So how much more when the living sacrifice, Yahushua Mashiach, that's the same grace. And you see people abuse it even today. So that's the grace that Paul spake about, and that was an example. Because where that sin abounded, you had that way to offer up animal sacrifice, even through Yahushua now. So you can't abuse that grace. It's like back then, where are you gonna find all these, turtle doves, all these sheeps, if you're going off all the time, So all these things, is witness. This is how, all these things were witness to the law and the prophets. Because in the law, like I said, and brought out, Yahushua was prophesied to come into the scene for the time to come. And in the prophets, this is what Paul spoke about. So let's bring out an example from the prophet Haggai. Let's go to the book of Haggai, chapter 2, verse 11. And it reads, "Thus saith the Lord of hosts, ask now the priest concerning the law, saying, if one bear holy flesh in the skirt of his garment, and with the skirt do touch bread or pottage, or wine, or oil, or any meat, shall it be holy? And the priest answered and said, No. Verse 13, then said Haggai, if one that is unclean by a dead body touch any of these, shall it be unclean? And the priest answered and said, it shall be unclean. So, you had priests during this time, they had the holy flesh, which was the sacrifices that they would slaughter and then offer up, whether it was burnt sacrifice, whether it was for atonement of sin. Either way, they had to bear these on their garments, because eventually, when they were, killing the animal, when they were offering it up, they had to, make the cakes with it, offer it up with the cakes, depending on what the sacrifice that they were making, and eventually, they'd have to have these things all over the place. So, Haggai is saying to the Most High, he's saying, if any of this sacrifice that you may be offering up at the time, if it touched something else, is it going to be unclean? Because it was a dead animal. It was offered up to be offered up. And they said no. And then he asked them, if one that's unclean with a dead body, and it touches any of these vessels, shall it be unclean? Because in I believe Numbers chapter 19, if you were if you saw a dead body and there was vessels in there, and you ran into it, all those things would be unclean, including the person. And they said it would be unclean because it's more so practical. That's the practical thinking that that one had back then, and they had that understanding. Verse 14. Then answered Haggai and said, so is this people, and so is this nation before me, saith the Lord, and so is every work of their hands, and that which they offer there is unclean. Because during that time, they were committing spiritual fornication, there was, condemning innocent blood, in the land. You had a lot of wicked priests. You had even during the times of Samuel, you had their sons, taking off a little extra off of the sacrifices, So this is what Haggai was speaking. And this was an example to use for the time to come, also in time of the Jews under the Romans. They were doing that same hypocrisy. This is one of the reasons. This is how the law had to be witnessed through the law and the prophets, like it says in the righteousness of God without the law is manifested. Because it was spoken of throughout the law and the prophets, and the works of the law they're witness unto themselves, to those committing, those hypocrisies. Salakia. So let's go back to the book of Romans, chapter 3, and verse 22. And it reads, even the righteousness of God, which is by faith of Yahushua HaMashiach unto all, and upon all of them that believe, for there is no difference. So this is Paul. He was talking about the Israelite foreigners and the Jews and the Gentiles. Verse 23, for all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. Verse 24, being justified freely by his grace through the redemption that is in Yahushua HaMashiach. Verse 25, whom God had set forth to be a propitiation through faith in his blood, to declare his righteousness for the remission of sins that are past through the forbearance of God. So again, this was why Yahushua was made for that atonement, for the atonement for sins. Verse 24, being justified freely by his grace through the redemption that is in Yahushua HaMashiach. So Paul is concluding that the Jews and Gentiles have that same redemption. They're able to come back to the covenant, just like the Jews who were impractically executing the law. They had the Israelite foreigners. This is why Yahushua, he said, I came not to save but the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So he came to bring the other fold back together. Verse 25, whom God has set forth to be a propitiation through faith in his blood, to declare his righteousness for the remission of sins that are past through the forbearance of God. To declare, I say, at this time his righteousness, that he might be just and the justifier of him which believeth in Yahushua. So Paul, is saying Jew or Gentile, there is no in verse 27, there is no boasting, none should be proud, but they should be, doing these things correctly, the executing of the law, coming back to the covenants, Israelite foreigners, coming back into the fold, knowing how, these things came to happen through the prophecies and through the law, coming back to the customs. Right? So, and like it says in the book of Isaiah 53, he came to save the whole nation of Israel. So that's how, you're justified through that grace. This is why Paul said, all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. He's not talking about the whole world back then, and it doesn't apply to now. You can't take something that applied to a group of people back then and then read it now and then say it applies to everybody. That's stupidity at its finest. You can't take verse 23 and apply it to today. Or verse 22, because again, this was to the Jews and the Israelite foreigners. This is how we know these things are true. If you read and you have the correct understanding. So let's move on to verse 27. Where is boasting then? It is excluded. By what law? Of works? Nay, but by the law of faith. So, Paul is saying, none of these groups should boast or be proud of anything. Because like I showed you, the Jews were following the law to a T by the letter, but they didn't execute the law correctly. But did only basically what appeared righteous, not what was morally correct. And the Gentiles, they were coming to the fold, they had that faith, and subconsciously were already keeping some commandments, but didn't have the moral direction and benefits of the law, of what was written in the law, the precepts, and keeping the commandments. But Paul was saying, he was essentially asking, when he said, by what law? He was asking essentially by what letter? Or by just following it by the letter, or when he said of works, or he was saying, can you do it just by trying to be righteous or morally correct without the law? You can't, because both of the things go hand in hand. So you have to know the letter, how to execute it, and then through your works. But it all starts from the inside. This is why you have to have that faith, This is what was essentially the law of faith. So he was saying none of these things, doing one thing didn't help nor the other. Right? So, but by the law of faith. So the law of faith, essentially inwardly having the faith and keeping the law correctly, and manifesting your inward man in your outward appearance and actions. Now, to establish that, let's go to the book of James, chapter 1 and verse 20. The book of James, chapter 1 and verse 20. And it reads, For the wrath of man worketh not the righteousness of God. Wherefore lay apart all filthiness and superfluity of naughtiness, and receive with meekness the engrafted word, which is able to save your souls. Verse 22. But be ye doers of the word, and not hearers only, receiving your own selves. So not only you have to lay away, the old man, the works that you used to do, and receive the word and be a doer of the word, not just hearing it. Verse 23, for if any be a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like unto a man beholding his natural face in a glass. So, you had the Jews back then, they were like that man, looking at himself in the mirror, just for a moment, and then it just, went away. Verse 24, for he beholdeth himself, and goeth his way, and straightway forgetteth what manner of man he was. So, this is why the law is important. You have, yes, you need faith, but you have to know, you have to keep the precepts in your mind and also execute them in righteousness. Verse 25, but whoso looketh into the perfect law of liberty and continueth therein, he be not a forgetful hearer, but a doer of the work, this man shall be blessed in his deed. And also, Book of James, chapter 2 and verse 18. A man may say, thou hast faith, and I have works. Shew me thy faith without thy works, and I will shew thee my faith by my works. So this is what, Paul was speaking on. Most likely, he learned this, through the apostles, but, the Lord's brother, James, he wrote about this too. So you have to have those things go hand in hand. The law, the letter of the law and your works. This is what Paul was speaking about. So let's move on to the next verse. But again, this chapter starts off by establishing the fact that a practicing Jew has its benefits, like it said in verse 2. Why did Paul say that? I think it gets overlooked way too easily. The fact that Paul is telling these Jews and Gentiles that one of the main benefits of being a practicing Jew, this was mainly, written for Israelite foreigners, verse 2, the Gentiles. The main benefit is that they were given the scriptures. The Jews, the Israelites. How is that beneficial? Well, if you were a Gentile at that time, you may have had the gospel preached to you. You may have had to believe in Yahweh Shai Mashiach. Paul and the apostles, you may have, received their teachings. Right? And you believe the salvation is promised. But you may not know where these things originated from in the scriptures. So you can't negate the fact that Paul, in the beginning of the chapter, is pointing these Jews and Gentiles to the law and the prophets. Because he even quotes them throughout all the epistles, like I've read in verses 19. Salakia, verses 10 through 19. That was him quoting Isaiah. 9 verses. And if you go to Isaiah, it's the same thing that he was writing on there in Romans 3:10 through 19. So this is why it's important to know where these prophecies and the law. So the main benefit is he wanted them to receive the scriptures, not just have faith. So you can't negate that first verse and then go to the last verse. That's why you have to have the proper understanding of Paul's letters, because he quotes them throughout all the time. So up to this point, essentially, Paul said, verses 1 through 4, it is good to practice as a Jew and to know the law and the prophets. Although some Jews did not believe the Israelite foreigners could be saved, he's saying, let the scriptures be true and everyone a liar. That's what he's saying, verses 1 through 4. Romans, let me pull it up right here. Just doing a quick review. So this is why he's saying, God, let God be true, but everyone a liar. Because in verse 2, he's pointing them to the where the things originated from. Verses 5 through 8, the Jews, mainly ruling class, he's getting on them. He's saying they abuse the law, and abuse the authority that it gave them to judge righteously, and this is Paul speaking. He's saying, verses 5 through 8, he's saying essentially, are we Jews better than these Israelite foreigners coming into the fold? Because we're not setting the right example either. And these Gentiles are attempting to return to their God-given customs and covenant, because it's proven over and over how the practicing Jews abuse the law and despise their foreign counterparts and Gentiles, which have also been under sin by leaving their former customs and following the way of the Greeks and the Romans. That's in verse 9. Verses 10 through 18, that's him quoting Isaiah 59, proving how these things were prophesied to happen, to the Gentiles, And this was him showing, how knowing the scriptures, along with their belief and the faith that they had, coming into the fold can be beneficial. So verse 19, and on down, the people under the law and those obligated to do it, Paul is showing that this does not exclude the Gentiles, and he's speaking to the Jews. Because if you go back to the law, there was that the people that it was given to. He's essentially pointing them to the beginning. Verse 20, Paul to the Gentiles, he's saying the Jews, they weren't justified, in their mishandling of the law. But the law used correctly is beneficial and outlines acceptable practices. That's what that verse is talking about. It tells you what sin is, tells you where you're going off, tells you how to properly keep the customs and the ways. Like it says in 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 8. So let's go to that precept real quick, and then we'll go back to the book of Romans. Book of 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 8. But we know that the law is good if a man use it lawfully. Right? So that's what Paul was speaking on, throughout all his epistles. You can't take one thing and run with it, or one verse and run with it. You have to take the body of his writings as a whole. But before you take it and apply it to your walk in his truth, you have to have the understanding of how it was written at that time. That's how you get the proper understanding. Let's go back to the book of Romans and the 3rd chapter. Now we're just doing a review from 21 on down to 26. So verse 21, the proper ways, Paul is saying keep the law, the righteous judgments of the law are manifested. The examples given in the law, Deuteronomy chapter 18, Yahushua being prophesied that he would come and magnify the law, and in the prophets, how they time and time again, the prophets were sent to reprove them for their mistakes, for their sins going off. Verse 22, on down, it's saying how Yahushua testified to the Jews how keeping the letter of the law was not the benefit. That was not the main benefit, nor was there any justification, in that, but starting with the inward man, like he spoke about in Romans, the 2nd chapter, and outwardly making, that righteous judgment, that was the purpose of the law, thus manifesting what is justifiable in the sight of the Most High, that righteousness, that's that righteousness, equity, uprightness, and the Messiah, also coming for the lost sheep, the Gentiles, and calling for their return to the covenant and repentance for them also. So this is what was spoken about in verse 22, upon them and all them that believe. Because you had Jews that didn't think the Gentiles were even worthy of coming back to the covenant. They despised the strangers. In verse 23, that's talking about all Israel, they went off, they sinned, Jews and Gentiles alike. And they are justified, the Gentiles, in returning to their covenants, because for that reason Yahushua was sent by the Most High to correct the Jews, unite the nation, bring in the foreign fold, the Gentiles, back to the nation. That's verse 24. And verses 25 to 26, the law offered the sacrifices. That's touching on the sacrifices as a way to cover sins, which was the former grace. Right? And and Yahushua, through the power given by the Most High, to forgive sin while he was on earth in the ministry, and ultimately offering him being offered up for all Israel as a living sacrifice, pursuant to the book of Isaiah chapter 53. So that's what it's talking about when all Israel sinned. And who gets that justification? Who gets the appropriation for sins? So you have to piece these things together. You can't take just one verse and make a whole doctrine out of it. So, that all, essentially, all Israel is going to, through that belief, Paul is saying they'll be justified in their forgiveness for sins through Yahushua. And even the latter grace, the grace in these times, first and foremost, how it was written, you got to understand it back then, and also for the time to come, for the times of today. Because Yahushua, he prophesied the destruction of Jerusalem during his ministry. And he prophesied the dispersion of Israel and all nations with the temple, with the temple where one had offered the sacrifices, in Jerusalem, it wouldn't be there, after he was offered up, after Paul went through the when the Jews attempted to kill him, and during his ministry and after the ministry, his ministry, all these things had to happen. Yahushua had to be offered up. The destruction of Jerusalem had to happen. So yeah, they kept keeping sacrifices, after Yahushua, but eventually the destruction would come. And they wouldn't be able to offer those sacrifices due to the destruction. So that's what it's talking about. That's that grace. It's talking about, in verse verse 26, this is how those Jews are justified. And from that time of the destruction, moving on forward. And verse 27, Jews and Gentiles alike have no right. This is Paul saying. So we gotta understand, all these things had to happen. This is how we have that we're justified in Yahushua Mashiach. And this is how they were justified back in those times, because the temple, had to be destroyed. Jerusalem, we'd have to get dispersed throughout all nations. This is that grace we have through Yahushua Mashiach. So Jews and Gentiles, alike, Paul is saying in verse 27, they have no right to boast, because there's still things that had to happen. Destruction had to still come, Israel had to get divided throughout the dispersion. This is why Yahushua had to be that living sacrifice. Because God, that's a great mercy that the Most High has done to Jews and Gentiles for that time and for the time to come. That's that great mercy. Because if not, we wouldn't be justified, because we wouldn't be able to keep the sacrifice in the temples. We wouldn't be able to go up to the feast days. Because the city would be destroyed ultimately. So this is what Paul is talking about, justified in believing in Yahushua Mashiach and atonement for sins. This is our justification. This is how we're justified in keeping the law and also in atonement for sins. Not just doing what you think is right. You need the law to have that moral compass. Not also because, Paul made a point in this chapter, that there were Jews who were following the law by the letter, but that didn't justify them. Neither, did the works that they were doing, because verses 5 through 8, Paul essentially was calling out the Jews who were mainly the ruling class, and those men like the men who told Yahushua that he should not heal on the Sabbath. So their works showed their hypocrisy. So the law of faith is knowing the letter of the law and starting inwardly in your inward man, believing faithfully that you will execute it in a righteous, equitable manner, and manifesting that through your works righteously. Now let's move on to verse 8. It's Book of Romans, verse 28. Book of Romans, chapter 3 and verse 28. Therefore, we conclude that a man is justified by faith. Therefore, we conclude that a man is justified by faith without the deeds of the law. Now, in this verse, Paul is moving on to a new subject. Here he is saying to the Jews that the Gentiles first are justified in their belief in the Messiah and in salvation, like I just explained previously. That's why I did the whole review, because leading up to this point, Paul is changing, the subject matter. And he, in the 4th chapter, he uses a similitude of Abraham, how he first believed, did what God was commanded, left his home country, forsaked all he had, just off pure faith. And then that justified him. He received the commandment of circumcision. So this is what the subject that Paul is moving on to, and this is what we're going to review in chapter 4. Now, verse 29, is he the God of the Jews only? Is he not also of the Gentiles? Yes, of the Gentiles also. Now, in verse 29, Paul said what he said in the previous verse so that he can establish, for that reason, he's the God of the Jews and the Israelite foreigners. Because don't the Jews believe first and then follow the covenant and the laws and the practices. So he's making a point here. He's saying, first thing is that faith, and then the works. Following the letter of the law, then your works. That's the law of faith. Because you can't do none of those things if you're faithfully, unless you have that faith and faithfully trying to execute those things. So verse 30, for that reason, Paul writes that God will justify both parties, just off faith in him, first and foremost. And in the last verse, Paul is making his final point on the fact that faith is of importance, and how your works through the law, how you manifest the true righteousness, which is through Yahweh B'Shem Yahushai. So let's read verse 30 and 31. Seeing it is one God, which shall justify the circumcision by faith, and uncircumcision through faith. Verse 31. Do we then make void the law through faith? God forbid. Yeah, we establish the law. So, this is how you establish the law, with faith. He's the God of the Jews and the Gentiles, because these are the same people. This is what Paul is trying to say. And he's going to justify, both of these people through their faith. This is why it says that a man is justified by faith without the deeds of the law. Because in verse 4, and actually that's important. Romans chapter 4 and 2. For if Abraham were justified by works, he hath whereof to glory, but not before God. Right? So the faith came first, and then the works. Let's see, verse 9. Cometh this blessedness then upon the circumcision only, or upon the uncircumcision also? For we say that faith was reckoned to Abraham for righteousness. How was it then reckoned? When he was in circumcision or in uncircumcision? So when did these things happen? When he was after circumcised or before? Not in circumcision, but in uncircumcision. So he had that faith and did what God commanded him, and then he received the covenant of circumcision. Verse 11, and he received the sign of circumcision, a seal of righteousness of the faith which he had yet being uncircumcised, that he might be the father of all them that believe. Right? So Paul is making the point, in the Torah, that the faith was first. And then that was a pattern of things to come for the nations, the two nations that would ultimately be split up. From the time of the Greeks and the Romans, during the times of Yahushua, Paul, and the apostles, up until now. But the reason why Paul is writing this is because of the point that he made in chapter 3. So this was a pattern of things to come. So those that were called circumcision and uncircumcision, they would be united by that faith. And Yahweh through Yahushai. So this was Romans chapter 3 is Yatazadak, hero Israel. We're giving honor and glory to Yahweh, B'Hashem Yahushai. Say Shalom.